And we're live. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another Fish the Moment live stream. We're on a new channel. Hopefully, not too many people got lost. I don't think we're going to have a huge number of people turning out tonight, but we might be surprised. Thanks for everyone making the transition. Hoping we can give you guys same content and just kind of make it a little bit less confusing with so many videos popping up on different channels. So, Randy, how's it going tonight?
Doing good here, man. Just getting ready for night stream. It's going to be interesting, man. Crankbait fishing's coming up. It's just right around the corner. As soon as that water temperature just starts rising up in February, they're going to be on those crankbaits, and it's time of year everybody needs to start learning how versatile they really are.
For sure. And today we're going to be talking about top 5 crankbait mistakes that new anglers make all the time, and a lot of experienced anglers as well. Randy and I both throw crankbaits a lot. I love throwing crankbaits whenever I can. It's one of the best bites to get on. And just so you guys know, if you're checking out this live stream back on YouTube, we are going to be actually making some super cuts of this stream so that we're going to break up all 5 sections, each tip into its own video, and post it on this channel. So I would highly recommend going down and subscribing to the Fish the Moment live YouTube channel, the channel that we're streaming on right now, so you don't miss any of those uploads. And that way, if you wanted to just look at each individual tip without having to watch through the entire video, we'll be posting a video pretty much every single day on this channel with exactly that. So got 30 people on, Randy, not too bad. And if you guys also could share out this stream on your social media pages with your friends, stuff like that, just so we can get some more people back on the channel. Normally we have about 400 people, 500 people tuning into the stream, and right now we're sitting at 36, so we want to make sure we can get out to as many people as we can. But without further ado, Randy, let's just jump straight into it. We got Jay Mavs, we got Brent, Mike, Steven, Ken, John, Max, Ryan, Scott, all the regulars. They made their way over here, which is awesome, and got 40 people on. So first mistake that Randy and I identified as really the most common mistake that crankbait fishermen make is that most anglers don't actually let their crankbait get down to the bottom or interact with some sort of object. This is a super common mistake that a lot of new crankbait fishermen make because they're really just scared of getting their crankbait hung up. If we take a look at a crankbait over here, I'm just going to pull up a couple examples of crankbaits. You'll see that your crankbaits have all these treble hooks on them. Well, you can't see the treble hooks here, but you'll have some treble hooks on these baits, and they're going to get hung up very often if you are trying to reel them through thick cover, brush pile, stuff like that, if you don't know what you're doing with the crankbaits. But there are a lot of ways you can actually work the crankbait in terms of your retrieve and your casting angle to avoid hangups while still interacting with cover. And so what we want to kind of talk about first is how to actually pick the right crankbait to hit the bottom of the lake, but also avoid getting hung up. And I'm just going to start with my top 4 suggestions for crankbaits, and then Randy will get into it here as well. Really, my crankbait selection is pretty straightforward. I have a few more that I throw that I'm going to talk about here, but I just want to give you guys 4 really good options to start out with when you're fishing a crankbait. My number 1 option, especially when I'm fishing deeper than 12 feet of water, is the Strike King 6XD crankbait. This bait dives anywhere from 12 to 20 feet of water, depending on your line size, and it has a really long bill on it, which allows it to deflect off cover really well. You can crank it straight through brush piles, standing timber, rocks, and you're not going to get hung up as long as you keep reeling that bait at a good speed. If you stop reeling a lot of times, that'll cause the bill of the bait to rise up and your hooks will get hung up in the cover. So as long as you continually reel that bait at a steady pace, the bill will actually deflect off cover and keep you out of trouble. Again, this bait is great when you're fishing in 12 to 20 feet of water offshore. The next bait that I throw a lot is the Spro Mike McClone Rock Crawler 55. This is a little bit smaller bait that dives anywhere from 9 to 14 feet of water. And it also has a pretty long bill which deflects cover. And I throw this bait whenever I'm fishing anywhere from 6 to about 12 feet of water. The bait dives 9 to 14 feet, but I'll throw it as shallow as 5 or 6 feet of water because that longer bill will deflect off cover and you won't have to worry about getting hung up at all. So you can grind that thing into rocks and into stumps and the bill will deflect it even in shallower water. And that's one tip I can give to you guys right now. When you're picking a crankbait, pick a crankbait that runs 2 to 3 feet deeper than the depth you're trying to fish. So if you're trying to fish 8 feet of water, pick a bait that runs 10 to 12 feet deep. That will ensure you're making bottom contact, and make sure it just has a nice good bill to deflect off the cover. The other bait I like to throw a lot when I get shallower water is the Megabass S-Crank Square Bill Crankbait. This is a square bill crankbait with a nice bill. Square bills are designed to deflect off a cover, and this bait comes through cover super well. Randy can talk about this bait a little bit more, and I'll kind of let you cover these, Randy. And this is a good shallow crankbait for when I'm fishing less than 6 feet of water. And then I also throw the Megabass Sonic Side flat or a square bill crankbait. It's a flat side crankbait, and whenever I'm fishing in colder water temperatures in less than 6 feet of water, this is the crankbait I go for. All these baits, though, have one thing in common. They have a bill that's designed to deflect off cover, which allows you to grind those baits into the bottom, off of rocks, off of stumps. And really, I don't get hung up on crankbaits that often at all, maybe only 2 or 3 times a day. And because a lot of times you're fishing shallow with these crankbaits, you can just go over there, knock the crankbait loose with your rod tip, and keep fishing. So that's kind of my suggestion on how to, one, avoid getting hung up with crankbaits, but also just some crankbaits to check out. Randy, what are your thoughts on all of that?
Yeah, crankbaits, there's so many different variables involved in choosing, the right crankbait, the right color, which we'll get into a little bit later. But one of the things that a lot of people need to realize on this crankbait fishing is that so much of the crankbait that you choose should be determined by, your water temperature, water clarity, the angle of the bank you're fishing, a lot of different variables. And I use so many different type of crankbaits just to match that particular situation. One of the things that you'll find about crankbait fishing is it's sort of a niche deal, because crankbaits is one of those lure categories that probably has more like local niche type popularities than any other crankbait that you have. I mean, for example, here in the Ozarks, you have the rock crawler or the wigglewort. You got the flat side homemade crankbaits in eastern Tennessee. You got the lipless crankbaits in the southeast, Florida, Texas, all that type of stuff. So there's a lot of different areas where specific profiles and actions work better than the others. But ultimately, it's a combination of water clarity, the depth, the cover, the mood, and the personality of the fish that you're after that determines the selection on that. And, like I said, that we could write a book on that too, but what we're going to try to do today is just to sort of give you a foundation, give you some basic guidelines to give you something to start from.
For sure. Oh, there's an echo on your audio, Randy. I'm going to throw some headphones in here, and that way we don't have to worry about the echo anymore. I always forget about that. Just give me 1 second here, guys. Okay, now you shouldn't have the echo anymore. Randy, can you still hear me okay?
Yeah, you can hear me.
Gotcha.
But
okay.
One of the things, there's been crankbaits has been such an evolution, because I can remember back, when I very first started bass fishing back my dad used to take me down to Grand Lake and Table Rock Lake back in the 1960s. And that's back when the only crankbaits that there were was like the metal lip bombers, hellbenders, that type of stuff. There were no other crankbaits besides that. And then you evolved into the 1970s, when they came out with the Big O. That was the original crankbait that really got the bait onto, to the next level of popularity. And then you saw an explosion in the 80s and 90s. And now there's so many different styles and profiles and applications for crankbaits. You just can't even keep up with it. It's like overwhelming a little bit. So we're going to try to simplify things a little bit.
Yeah, and that's what I tried to do, guys, when I gave you that list of crankbaits just as a top level. Really, there are so many crankbaits. If we just go over to just like the crankbait page, so baits and the other crankbaits, you have shallow diving crankbaits, medium divers, deep divers, extra deep divers, oversized crankbaits, lipless crankbaits, so many options. And honestly, the actual crankbait itself, while it can make a big difference, the shape, the size, things like that, when you're just starting out crankbait fishing, I wouldn't get too caught up in all of those subtle differences, because really, on average, if you go to these shallow diving crankbaits, throwing a 13 fishing square bill crankbait versus a 6 cents versus a Balsa B versus a Strike King or whatever other crankbait you're throwing won't make a huge difference in the number of fish you catch. If you maybe throw like a Balsa crankbait versus a plastic crankbait, you might get 2 or 3 extra bites throughout the day, but it's not going to dramatically change your crankbait results. The most important things are the things we're going to talk about here in a minute, which are the other common mistakes anglers make. But really, the one thing I would recommend is just not getting too caught up in all of the different body styles, shapes, stuff like that. Just pick up a few crankbaits that you might hear in videos that anglers recommend in each season, like for example a flat side crankbait like the Sonic side when it's colder, or when it's warmer like the Megabass S crank, which has a wider wobble, and then some of these deeper divers like we mentioned earlier, and go out and just fish. Now, one thing that I think really is going to help improve your offshore fishing game, which is again that first, or your crankbait fishing game, is that first mistake of making sure you make bottom contact. And so if I share my screen here, one thing I want to show you guys is a PowerPoint that I have real quick. You guys know I love my graphics. And this is something that I see a lot of anglers do when they're crankbait fishing. They will cast their crankbait out, they will let it hit the water, and they'll just start reeling it. And they'll reel it at kind of a normal, steady pace, and it'll get down, let's say, 2/3 of the way to the bottom. It will not hit any sort of objects, rock, cover, wood, anything like that, and then it will swim back up and come back to the boat. And you have missed the entire strike zone with that crankbait. What happens a lot of times is that that strike zone where those fish are might only be 20 to 30 feet long. And it might be a rock pile, a brush pile, stumps, whatever it is, a lay down on the bank. And you need to have your bait interacting with the rocks, the cover, whatever is down there, bouncing off the cover for those bass to actually eat your bait. And what happens is that if your bait is not ever reaching that cover, you're never going to get bit. The other thing that can happen is that you might not be picking a deep enough crankbait to keep your bait in the strike zone long enough. For example, if you're throwing this rock crawler, maybe you're fishing in 12 feet of water, and this bait runs 12 feet deep. But maybe by the time that bait hits its maximum depth at 12 feet, it just barely enters the strike zone for a second or two and then is out of the strike zone. And you'll never get that fish to bite, or you have a very small opportunity to get that fish to bite. Versus if we switched out the rock crawler for a deeper diving crankbait, you might be able to get a bait that dives 16 to 18 feet deep, and you can start digging the bottom 10 feet before you reach that rock pile or that offshore area, grind that bait through the entire strike zone, and you'll have that bait in the strike zone for 5-10 seconds, which gives you a lot better opportunity to get bit. So the one thing I never can stress enough on crankbait fishing is pick a crankbait that runs 2 to 3 feet deeper than the spot you're trying to fish. If you're trying to fish a rock pile in 15 feet of water, pick a crankbait that dives 18 to 20 feet. If it's in 8 feet of water, pick a crankbait that dives 10 to 12 feet of water. Another thing that's really important is you want to make sure you don't position your boat in a way that's going to hinder how deep this crankbait dives. And that's actually the second big mistake. Before we move on from that, Randy, I just want to kind of give you the last word on this. Any other advice for the guys on trying to avoid getting that crankbait to run or to hit the bottom? Or to actually make it hit the bottom?
Well, the important thing about that is it's sort of the same with jerkbait fishing, because in crankbait fishing or jerkbait fishing, you have a small window during your cast that you really have a high percentage of catching a quality bass. And like in crankbait fishing, if you're not bouncing that bait off of something or making contact with something, and say, for example, you get a bite on the way down, or if you get a bite on the way up, or if you happen to get a bite where the bait is not hitting the bottom, that's a rarity. And most of the time, those are going to be smaller fish. But those good fish, those quality 4-pound plus bass, are going to be coming when that bait is at its deepest point, or it's bouncing off something hard. It doesn't make any difference. So from an efficiency standpoint, that is the way that you have to, you got to, select the right tool for the job. That being said, I will say one thing. One of the things that I like to try to do in my crankbait fishing is I like to try to get certain crankbaits into areas that most people don't think are applicable for that. And for an example, I like to throw real small crankbaits and try to get them deeper than what most people can get little crankbaits. I'm still wanting to hit the bottom with it. And sometimes I'll throw a big deep diving crankbait in 2 or 3 foot of water just to give the fish a different look. So there's a lot of different variables to that. That basically, just the one thing you need to remember as far as picking that right crankbait, the longer that you can keep that bait hitting the bottom in that strike zone, the better chance you got of catching a good one.
And apparently I did not show you guys any of the graphics I was doing. Sorry guys, I've changed up some stuff here on the streaming software for this new channel. So that's what happened there. Let me show you guys that again. So to reset, when you're trying to ensure your bait is hitting the bottom, a lot of times what guys will do is they'll get that bait to hit the water, they'll reel it, and it'll get 2/3 of the way down to the strike zone. And let's say in this situation, I'll just kind of put a little text box. I'll do a better job even than I did before. Maybe your strike zone is like right here. This is where those fish are. And so if they're in that strike zone right there, and man, I'm going all out, Randy, with this graphic right now. You guys are getting a treat. Doing transparency, boom. Okay, there we go. So got the strike zone. If that strike zone is set up right there, then you need to make sure that your bait is landing in that strike zone, hitting into the strike zone and going through the rocks. The only way you're going to do that is to ensure your bait gets down to the bottom or to the object you're fishing before you actually make contact with it, maybe 10 to 12 feet, maybe 15 feet before you actually get to the strike zone, then work all the way through the strike zone and come out the other side. Again, if you're throwing a crankbait that only dives 12 feet deep in 12 feet of water, that bait might dive down, hit the kind of the top of the strike zone right in 12 foot for a second, and then come back out. So that bait's only in the strike zone for a second or two. And in that case, what you need to do is go to a deeper diving crankbait. And even if you're throwing a crankbait that dives 18 feet deep in 12 foot of water, that's not that big of a deal because the bills in these crankbaits are so big, they'll deflect off the cover and stuff like that. So you can start grinding that crankbait in the bottom maybe a third of the way through the cast, and even if you have it hit the bottom 20 feet before the strike zone, you're going to guarantee that it goes through the entire strike zone for the entire cast, or the entire portion of the strike zone, and you give your you give the fish a chance to eat that bait a lot more. That bait's going to be in the strike zone for 5 to 10 seconds, and you're going to have a lot more success with your crankbaits. This applies for when you're fishing shallow water and offshore. It's not exclusive to offshore fishing. I'm just using this example right here. So hopefully that graphic explained what we were talking about earlier. So sorry about that, guys. Need to always remember the transition screens. There's so much going on. I got a PowerPoint here. I got the chat. I got Randy. So try and do the best we can, guys. But anyways, so that's it for the first mistake that a lot of crankbait fishermen make, not hitting the bottom or not hitting objects with their crankbaits. The second big mistake that anglers make when they're crankbait fishing is they get the wrong casting angle, whether they're fishing offshore or up shallow. Casting angles are absolutely critical when you're offshore fishing because the bait needs to be getting in the strike zone and you need to be hitting a very small spot. And even though it's pretty important to offshore, it's even more critical up shallow. And so I'm going to start by talking about the offshore casting angles with some graphics, and then I'll let Randy get into the shallow water casting angles. And while I'm talking about this, Randy, pull up graphics. If you could pull up Google Earth and just kind of have that ready to share so you can kind of show us casting angles for some shallow cranking stuff. So let me pull up Navionics here, and I'll at least start with the offshore crankbait fishing. So let me pull up Navionics. There we go. And whenever I am trying to pick a crankbait spot, one of the key things I'm looking for, and I'm just going to go to Grand Lake because it's a great crankbait lake, is you're trying to find a place where there's some sort of depth change. I'm going to give you a really obvious example here in the back of Drowning Creek. Here is a really obvious ledge where the bottom goes from shallow water, let's say 3 to 5 feet of water, and drops into 30 feet of water with a very abrupt depth change. This is what you call ledge, and throwing crankbaits offshore on ledges is one of the best ways to catch fish. You can also catch fish, though, on areas like this, which is called a point. And a point is an area where you have shallow water that sticks out to the lake and then drops off into deeper water. In both these cases, you have shallower water, 5 to 7 feet, dropping into deeper water, around 20 feet. Now, this is a shallower spot, but you could also find ledges that are deeper than this. You could go over here and find a ledge where the top of the ledge is in 20 feet of water, or the top of the point is in 20 feet of water, and it drops off into 40 or 60 feet of water. Regardless of the depth of water you're fishing, though, and I'm going to go back to our example because it's just a little bit cleaner, The key is that you want to make sure that your bait is in the area where the depth changes from shallower to deeper water as long as possible. And that's where your key strike zone is usually on these offshore areas. It's basically where these contour lines go from being very spread apart to very tight together. And you're not actually trying to fish your crankbait where the lines are tight together. It's actually going to be about 10 to 15 feet up onto the flatter portion. So up here or kind of up in this area. You don't want to be right where the contours break super tight. You want to be where they start to flatten out a little bit, 10 to 15 feet up on top of those areas. That's where most of your offshore fish are going to be setting up. It's kind of like the feeding table for the fish. The flatter sections, that's where the fish feed. And the key to fishing a crankbait offshore is that you need to make sure that you're positioning your boat in a way that your bait is landing up on top of the flat, getting down to depth, and then landing in this strike zone. What this means is that you don't want to actually position your boat too far out in the middle of the lake. I see a lot of guys when they try crankbait fish, they'll put their boat out here in 20, 25 feet of water, and when they make their casts, their bait is landing right on the edge of the ledge, right where the contour lines start to get tighter together. What happens is that your bait is actually landing right on top of where the fish are, but because of the nature of a crankbait, it has to dive down first before it gets to the fish. So if I pull up that handy dandy PowerPoint here again, what's happening is that a lot of guys are casting their crankbaits out and their baits are hitting the actual, actually let me grab this. I'll give you a better example of an actual ledge. This is what I'm talking about here. So here's some fish. Here's a fish on the ledge. And you can see they're kind of not on the downslide right here. That downslide, that's the same thing as like where those contour lines are tight together. That right there is the exact same as this right here. These fish are setting up on top of the drop. And what will happen is a lot of guys will cast their crankbait. They'll have it land right on top of where the fish are, but then it has to dive down for like a third of the cast. And by the time the bait actually gets down to the depth, it's nowhere close to the fish. It's way out in front of the ledge. It's over deeper water, and they never actually get bit. Therefore, you actually have to make sure your bait lands well past the fish, can dive down to depth, and then go through the fish like this. And that's why a lot of guys just do not catch fish on crankbaits, because they never get their bait where the fish actually are. They cast their bait to where they think the fish are, but they forget to account for the diving time. And usually it takes about a third of the cast for that bait to get down to depth, maybe even more than that, sometimes half the cast to get that bait down to depth. So if I was going to set up on Navionics here, what I would be trying to do is I would basically be trying to get my bait to land pretty far up on top of the flat or pretty far up on top of this point. What this means is I need to position my boat pretty close to that drop, almost right on the lip where that where the lake starts to come up, where the drop starts to come up. So if we pull up that image again, just to kind of give you guys an idea, where you would want to position that your boat is pretty much right where the drop ends, right where the bottom starts to kind of flatten out again in the channel. So right about here, this will allow you to make a long cast way past the fish and then dive through those fish. That's the key with fishing a deep diving crankbait. And if we kind of pull this back up, your boat's sitting here more in the channel, you're casting way up on the flat and reeling it in. And this might mean that your bait is grinding into the bottom. And I've actually caught fish off this exact spot right here on a 6XD crankbait. And I put that bait, it was actually a little bit more out towards the end here, and the fish were setting up in like 9 to 10 foot of water, but I was still throwing a 6XD crankbait that went 15 feet deep. All I did was I adjusted my line size. I went to a little bit heavier line so the bait dove a little bit shallower. And my bait was actually landing in 5 feet of water, and it was grinding on the bottom until I got to those fish. And I was digging up mud, but then when I got to the strike zone, my bait was already on the bottom, and those fish were just absolutely crushing it. So that is the key with these offshore casting angles with your crankbait, and it has to do with getting the bait down to the bottom, but also just making sure that you're in the strike zone as long as possible. So that's all I had right there. So Randy, let's jump back over to you and maybe have you share your screen and talk about some shallow water crankbait casting angles.
Okay.
While he's doing that, guys, since we have some time, go down below and hit the like button on this live stream, and also go down and hit the subscribe button. If you haven't subscribed to this YouTube channel, we're going to be making super cuts of all of the content from this live stream. Every point we talk about, we're going to actually make a quick YouTube video about it on this channel. And if you don't want to miss upcoming live streams on the new Fish the Moment Live channel, go subscribe. This is not the Fish the Moment channel. It's actually a brand new YouTube channel. So go down and subscribe there if you haven't. It'll help us out as well.
Okay, can you see my screen, Johnny?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay, I pulled up Grand Lake here, guys, as an example, because Grand's a really good shallow cranking lake. And first of all, casting angles when you're talking about fishing targets doesn't matter if it's whatever type of cover it is, wood, rock, whatever like that. And I'm talking, when we talk about shallow cranking, we're talking like say 7 feet or less, pretty much bank or object oriented. There's a couple different things to remember. First of all, a lot of it has to do with the angle of the bank that you're fishing. Now, say, for example, right here, this is like a main creek, sort of a bluffy, steep bank, bluffy type bank, sharp drops into like 25 or 30 foot of water. Now, if I'm fishing a bank like this, let's say in the pre-spawn, because it's going to be different. If I fish this in the pre-spawn versus like the summer, the fish will be positioned differently. But say that I'm fishing this particular bank when the water temperature, starts to get in the low 50s. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get that bait down in the zone where I believe the fish are, and that's totally relative to the water clarity that you're in. And let's say for at Grand Lake, for example, say we've got like 1.5 feet of visibility. In 1.5 feet of visibility, I sort of know that those bass are going to be sort of in that, probably that 4 to 7 foot range in that visibility. So what I want to do is I want to maximize my time on this bank in that 4 to 7 foot zone. And by doing that, you have to get your boat parallel to the bank, make long casts, probably anywhere, depending upon the bank angle, anywhere between 2 to 3 feet off the bank, to get it down into that 4 to 7 foot zone for the maximum amount of time. And when you're cranking a steep bank of any type, it's very important not to slop your casts out there, because if you cast like a foot too far to the left or a foot too far to the right, your bait's either going to be too shallow or too deep. So when you're fishing these steep vertical banks like this, you need to make sure that your casting accuracy is accurate to get that bait down to the zone you need. You don't ever want to like 45 a bank like this. You want to get close in, all relative to the drop, to keep that bait in that strike zone where you feel the fish are. Now, say, for example, that you're working down this bank right here and you come to this little secondary point here. And again, the water temperature is 55 degrees, water visibility is 1.5 feet. You want to make sure that you fan cast that same zone across the point here. So if I'm coming down the bank right here, right about here, I'm going to be making fan casts, trying to get into that 4 to 8 foot zone across the point. I'm going to come around. I'm not going to make any cast straight into the point. I'm going to come around the opposite side, and I'll make the same cast in the opposite direction on that little secondary point. Because a lot of times when you're cranking shallow water points, and when I'm talking about points, I'm not talking about these obvious type points. I'm talking about little subtle points. They can be only like maybe sticking out 4 or 5 feet. You need to make sure that you come across those points at both angles, because a lot of times you don't know how those rocks are setting up down there. You don't know how those fish are positioned. So I always make casts from 2 different directions of the angles on the secondary points. Okay, now let's take a different option here. Let's say we go to a little bit flatter banks. And see this right here, you got a steep bank here. You got a transitional bank coming into like gravel, pea gravel like type of stuff. And anytime you have that transitional change, you're going to have shallower water farther off the bank. So when I get into the transitional areas, like the rock transition areas into flatter areas, that's when I'm moving my boat out and I'm casting at a 45-degree angle. Because by casting at that 45-degree angle, I'm hitting that sweet spot of like 4 to 7 foot deep on that 45-degree angle cast. I'm not tied in. I'm not out throwing straight in. I'm casting at a 45 on those flatter banks. Again, your casting angle on the shallow cranking is relative to how the bank drops off and how deep the water is, how deep you want the bait to go, water clarity, and that type of stuff. Okay, now let's go back, and I'll take you to the back of the creek here, and I'm going to show you. But really my favorite type of shallow cranking, which is on, shallow wood. To me, when you're talking about shallow cranking, it's basically going to be a wood or a rock deal for the most part. I prefer wood because, I just think that you catch, more quality fish off of wood. So we'll zoom out on this flat here, this main lake flat. You got some isolated laydowns out on this flat here. Now, I don't care what time of year you're fishing. If you're fishing this, this is like 3 or 4 foot of water all around this. There's no breaks, no deep water. It's just a big flat, 3 to 4 foot deep with an isolated laydown tree there. This is where shallow cranking becomes an art form. And anytime you have water temperatures that are like above 60 degrees, 60 to 90 degrees, and these fish are starting to use this type of cover, casting angle on this type of stuff is critical. And so what you want to do is, like, say your boat's coming in from this direction. Before you get to the cover, you want to take note of different things. You want to take note of the wind direction, the angle of the sun. You want to look at the cover and find out where the shady sides are, where the sunny sides are, and you want to position your boat way before you get to the piece of cover to make that optimum cast on that piece of cover. Because for the most part, if there's a bass there, you're going to catch that bass within the first 2 or 3 casts, or you're going to catch it after like 25 casts. There's not like much in between. There's either going to be a good aggressive fish ready to bite on a laydown like this, or any other type of isolated cover, or there's going to be a fish there that's non-aggressive that you got to trigger from a different casting angle. So what I want to do is I take all this to consideration. First of all, I determine the wind direction. I don't want my boat drifting into the cover, so I want to make sure that I position the boat where I have complete control of the boat, where I don't drift in too close to the cover, where I'm not too far away. I want to make sure my boat's coming at the right angle. Then I analyze where the shady part is, and I make my first cast anywhere that shade is. I'm trying to hit that shade. And then based upon how the piece of cover is fishing, I want to try to go parallel to everything because it gives you more of an ambush point. Once I've made 5 or 6 casts from that particular angle, that's when I'll get the boat out a little bit further and I'll start firing off different casts from different angles. I'll come in, crossways to it. I'll maybe throw over a piece of wood and get that crankbait to come up over the wood and down the other side. And then I just try to make as many casts to that piece of isolated cover that I can to trigger that non-aggressive fish. So, and this is the same anytime you've got any type of isolated cover. It can be a rock, it could be an isolated dock, it can be a laydown, it could be an isolated grass clump, it could be a lot of different structures. But the biggest thing you need to remember when you're determining the angle that you need to cast from is, getting that bait in the high percentage area on your first 2 or 3 casts with that. Don't slop through an area. You need to be stealthy. You need to come up on it slow, and that's going to make a big determination in that. The other thing would be laydowns on the bank, like this right here. You got this bank with a lot of laydowns on it. When you're fishing laydowns that come off a bank, again, your casting angle is critical. Say, for example, let's see this tree right here. If I'm coming down this particular bank right here, and I've got this tree here, say the water's 5 foot deep on the end, the casting angle I want to have, my first cast to this piece of cover right here, and obviously it would be better if it's isolated, but there's a lot of laydowns here. But my first cast here, the angle is going to come parallel to the outside of this tree right here, because first of all, there's probably some limbs underwater that you can't see. So by me making a cast completely parallel to that laydown right there, I'm going to hit whatever deeper limbs are. And then once I get closer to it, my casting angle is going to be parallel to the outside on both sides. And then maybe I'll make a cast in between some nooks and crannies in the middle there. So basically, shallow cover, the things you need to remember: pay attention to the depth, pay attention to the angle of the bank, the water visibility, and the wind and the shade before you make your casting angle.
That has some golden information there, guys. If you were not taking notes, rewatch that segment. We'll post this as its own video on the channel too. But that was some really good stuff there, Randy. That's like 30 years of crankbait knowledge combined in about 10 minutes there. That was awesome.
Well, there's a lot more to it. That's the thing about it. It's like we could talk for 3 or 4 hours on how to fish this laydown tree out here, because when you start, just say for example, on this laydown tree, you got not only you have the casting angles, but you got to hit on the right combination of color, line size, speed of retrieve, cadence, hesitation. Things change with the sunlight conditions, light penetrations, fishing pressure. It's just, that's why, again, fishing is the most complicated sport on the planet. So much to it.
Good stuff. Well, I'm going to answer a couple questions here, and then I'm going to jump to the next question, or the next reason why anglers struggle, the next mistake. One comment we had was from Ryan. He said, a lot of good info, but I've noticed you use Grand Lake for all your comparisons. Not every lake fishes like Grand Lake. What about the deep, clear southern reservoir? Things like that. Well, the information we're talking about here, guys, it can relate to pretty much any fishery around the country. The information we're giving is not specific to Grand Lake. We're just using it as an example lake because Grand Lake has clearer water, has dirtier water, has steeper banks, shallower banks. And actually, Grand Lake is a great lake to kind of use as a catch-all. It's not going to catch everything, but just to give you an idea of a deep, clear southern reservoir, Ryan, here's Lake Lanier. The 10-foot of water visibility spotted bass. The exact same things Randy and I are talking about with the casting angles, with the bait selection, all of those apply to Lake Lanier as well. The big thing that's going to be different, though, is that crankbaits are not going to be universally successful in all water clarities and all conditions. If you're fishing on Lake Lanier, you're going to struggle to catch fish on a crankbait, except for in very specific seasons of the year, down by the dam in 10-foot water visibility. Maybe only during like the pre-spawn time of the year, or maybe like the late fall, early winter, can you actually go catch fish on a crankbait really well in the lower end of Lake Lanier. However, if you go up towards the dirtier part of Lake Lanier, up some of the rivers, there's a lot of great crankbait water. And if you basically have less than 4 foot of visibility, you should be able to get on a good crankbait bite. That's kind of the key water visibility that's going to help you catch more fish. So even if you are on a clear reservoir like a Lake Lanier, 10 foot of visibility, go find water that has less than 4 foot of visibility, and you can find that in almost any lake across the country. Go find that more stained water, and you'll be able to apply everything we're talking about with crankbaits. If you do want to try to catch fish on crankbaits in clear water, you either need to have some sort of heavy wind or heavy cloud cover, and you also need to have the fish positioned in shallower water. 80% of the year on Lake Lanier, your spotted bass and your largemouth are going to be chasing blueback herring out in the middle of the lake, and you need to use swim baits and other things to go catch those fish. But when those fish are up on the bank in the pre-spawn or the late winter, or maybe even like the late fall, early winter time, some of those largemouth and spotted bass will be up on these shallower banks, and you can catch them in ways that Randy was talking about. So you have to be there. Again, there's so many factors you could get into. I've made some really good videos explaining the best winter crankbait areas on the Fish the Moment YouTube channel, so check those videos out. Just type in Fish the Moment winter cranking. I've made a bunch of videos talking about that. I've made a lot of crankbait videos in general, but that is one thing we had. Another question is from Mike, can you back or float out a deep diving crankbait similar to how you can with a square bill? And what you're probably talking about there, Mike, is, if you could stop sharing your screen here real quick, Randy, is a lot of times when you get a crankbait hung, you can kind of like do the buggy whip, or kind of like the arrow where you like take your line and pop the bait free. And you can sometimes do that with deep diving crankbait, but one technique that works really well for me is, one, I start by dropping a plug knocker down, like a Hound Dog plug knocker from Jewel. It's a really good one. It's called the Hound Dog, and you can find it at Tackle Warehouse. And you can drop that thing down and get the crankbait free. But if not, one thing I've done in the past is just reel down as far as you can on that crankbait. Get directly over the top of the crankbait, reel down as tight as you can get your line, and then pull up really quickly and snap your line. A lot of times that will rebound that crankbait back and it'll float up. And I would say about 30 to 40% of the time, when you get straight over the crankbait, reel really tight, and pull straight above that bait really fast and pop the bait or break your line, that bait will float back up. And it's about 30 to 40% of the time you get your bait back. So just a way to save a couple crankbaits here and there. Now, before we jump into the next common mistake, I want to quickly talk to you guys about one thing we have going on over on fishthemoment.com. So if you guys just head over to fishthemoment.com, we have an upcoming virtual seminar that is coming up this Thursday. It's an advanced electronics seminar. There's very few spots left. There's 4 spots available as we speak. So definitely head over if you guys want to learn more about how to use your side imaging, down imaging, and 2D sonar to find fish offshore. I'm going to be focusing this as an advanced class. So I actually have playlists on my YouTube channel as well as here on the fishthemoment.com. If you go to the learning plans page, you can actually find my offshore bass fishing learning plans with all my sonar and fish finder basics videos for free. So you can go on here, check all these videos out for free, and then after you watch all these videos, you'll have a good understanding of how to know the basics of your fish finder, and you can sign up for this virtual seminar. And I'm going to be going into more advanced strategies, how to identify if fish are actively feeding versus not, which baits to throw based on what you see on your graph, when you should return to a spot after graphing it. Maybe when you graph a spot, don't see fish, but maybe you should return 2 or 3 hours later because fish might still be there, things like that. Really advanced electronic stuff as well as some advanced settings. Definitely check out the seminar. Only 4 spots left. It's this Thursday. And even if you can't attend live, you can actually get a recording of this webinar if you sign up. So just sign up. If you can't attend live, then we'll send you the recording afterwards, no problem. And I also have the seasonal bass movement seminar that's coming up the first week of February. And I'll talk about this more later. This is the most exciting seminar we're going to be given all year. I'm so excited about this one. I'm going to put like probably 20, 30 hours into the slides for this because it is a topic I love talking about. So if you guys are interested, this is seasonal bass movement on man-made lakes with shad or herring. If your lake has shad or blueback herring in it, this will change your fishing year-round, and it's going to be the best investment you make out of anything we have on Fish at the Moment. This right here is going to be an awesome seminar. The electronic seminar is also amazing, but this is kind of more of a catch-all for shallow fishing. Offshore fishing doesn't really matter. So that's all I want to talk about. One other thing too, real quick, I guess, is with our lake breakdowns. You guys know about lake breakdowns, 40 GPS waypoints. We've added a bunch of spring maps recently. Randy's been kicking these spring maps out, and they basically apply March through May, though a lot of times you can get some of these spots to work in February as well, especially further down south. So definitely check out these spring map breakdowns on the fishmoment.com website. So that's about it. Let's jump back over to talk about the top 5 crankbait fishing mistakes. And the third mistake that a lot of anglers make when they're trying to fish a crankbait is that they're using the wrong speed of retrieve or the wrong retrieve in general. The most common way that guys throw a crankbait, whether it's a square bill or a deep diver, is they cast that bait out, they let it hit the water, and they just reel it in at a steady pace. They just kind of take an easy approach, just kind of reel it in. And while this can catch fish, it's usually the least effective strategy for catching fish when you're throwing a crankbait. Now, Randy has a lot of secret retrieves and cool stuff that he'll talk about here in a second. My way of fishing a crankbait is mainly focused on deeper diving crankbaits. I don't really fish that many shallow diving crankbaits anymore because I fish 90% of my time offshore. And what I find is that with a crankbait offshore, there's really only 2 retrieve speeds you need to have. The first is reeling it as fast as you possibly can reel it and just burning it back to the boat. This will cause that bait to deflect violently off cover and trigger a lot more reaction strikes. And I find that when I'm throwing a deep diving crankbait or any crankbait that dives deeper than about 7 or 8 feet deep, the faster you can reel that crankbait, when the water temperature is above 50 degrees, the more bites you get. Now, once that water temperature hits below 50 degrees and gets like in that 45 degree range, I completely switch it up and go to a very slow retrieve. And basically what I do is reel 7 or 8 times to get that bait down to the bottom. Then I'll just reel that bait as slow as I possibly can to maintain bottom contact. So you're just barely cranking that reel handle, maybe speeding it up every once in a while to maintain bottom contact. And when those fish are super lethargic offshore in the wintertime, especially if you're fishing on steeper banks or like little offshore rocky spots off the bank, throwing a 8 to 12 foot diving crankbait, like a rock crawler, a wiggle wart, something like that, and just crawling it across the bottom can generate a lot of good strikes. And so I find that if you're going to catch fish on crankbait, especially off the bank, either reeling it as fast as you possibly can when the water temperature is above 50 degrees is the best, or then when it's below 45 degrees, as slow as you can possibly reel it while maintaining contact with the bottom. Those are the two ways you do it. So, Randy, what are your thoughts there?
Well, shallow water fishing, the retrieves on it, there's a lot more diversity that you have to come up with. So I'm going to give away a big secret here. Again, I've given up so many secrets last couple of months here. But one of the things I want to do, first of all, before I give that secret away, let's talk a little bit about it. The retrieve that you want to use for shallow water is determined by water visibility and water clarity both, and the type of crankbait you're using, because some crankbaits, they basically fight you a lot more than other ones. Some of them, if you're throwing like a shad wrap crankbait, it pretty much comes through the water without much effort. But if you're throwing, like a wiggle wart or like a DD22 or something like that, it fights you all the way back to the boat. And your reaction of when you do like a stop and go retrieve, how that bait reacts to that stop and go retrieve has a lot to do with the bill angle of that bait. But basically what you want to remember in crankbait fishing, if I can tell you one tip before I get to the secret, is you got to use stop and go all the time. There's very few crankbaits that I ever fish that I just reel straight in. In fact, I don't think there's any of them on that. And a stop and go retrieve isn't like as simple as just cranking it a few times, stop and go. A lot of it has to do with how fast you're cranking prior to when you stop, and it has to do with how quick you start it up again. And this variation a lot of times is something you have to experiment with based upon the water clarity and the water temperature. For the most part, just the foundational aspect that's very common knowledge is that the colder and the dirtier the water is, the slower that you need to keep your retrieve, and vice versa. As the water visibility gets cleaner and warmer, that's when you need to speed it up a little bit. And there's a lot of variations between that, because when you're talking about cold water cranking, I don't really start doing much cranking until the water temperature starts to get in the upper 40s. But there's a big separation between the water temperature getting in the upper 40s to when it's 90 in the summertime of the year. And every time you've got like a 5-degree separation in that water temperature, that's can require a different rate of speed on your retrieve and your pauses and your stop and go retrieve. So that's a matter you just have to experiment. But basically, use that stop and go retrieve all the time. The big secret I want to tell you guys that will really help you as far as your retrieve on your crankbaits in shallow water is learn to pull your crankbait through the water. And what I'm talking about is when you cast it out there and you get that bait down to the sweet spot, to the maximum depth where it's starting to hit bottom, try fishing your crankbait like you would like a football head jig. Crank it a little bit, stop it, and then don't reel and just pull. And as you take up the slack, don't keep the bait coming forward by speeding up your retrieve as you pull it and give it slack. So in other words, you're coming through the water, you're hitting the bottom, and you're pulling it like that without reeling, and then speed up like that to catch up with it again. The bait's still moving a little bit, but there's something about that pulling motion that you have without cranking the rod that basically it not only gives you better feel, but it gives the bait a little bit different action on there that you can't get from a normal straight stop and go retrieve. That's a big secret here in the Ozarks that a lot of people don't understand, especially in cold water cranking. Another thing like that I like to do as far as retrieve is when you're bouncing off objects. It doesn't matter if you bounce off rocks, wood, laydowns, whatever. When you come across an object and your bait's really fighting to get over that object, and you can feel it digging in or hitting a limb hard or something like that, as soon as you get free from that object where you don't feel it anymore, that's when you need to really smoke that bait for just maybe 2 or 3 cranks of the handle. Because a lot of times when you're hitting something real hard, you're getting the attention of the bass. The bass is looking at it. You got its attention. You got it interested. And when it gets free from whatever it's knocking off of and deflecting, and you speed that bait up real quick, a lot of times that'll generate the strike. But there's no book that you can read on say, hey, you need to throw your bait with this retrieve under these conditions, and it's going to work. Fishing doesn't work like that. It's a matter of experimentation. If something's working, stay with it. If it's not working, just hey, try something different for 10 minutes, a different retrieve. So just keep an open mind, keep experimenting.
That's awesome stuff. And as you're talking about that, Randy, I feel like my earlier description wasn't nuanced enough, because that's exactly how I work my deep diving crankbaits, but not because I'm intentionally doing it. When I'm casting that bait and I'm burning it really fast, when I'm throwing my deep diving crankbaits, they're always digging the bottom. And so to keep the bait from getting unhung, or keep the bait from getting hung, I have to stop my retriever every once in a while to let that bait come over the top of the cover. And one way I do that is actually pulling the bait through brush piles, through rocks, and then as soon as I feel like it's free, I start burning it again really fast. And so, like you said, it's the exact retrieve you just mentioned. It's just I don't consciously think about it. I'm just basically, my thought process is reel that bait as fast as you can, and then when you feel like you're going to get hung, stop it, pull it through the cover, and then keep burning it. It's the exact retrieve you're using there. And then when I'm fishing it slow again, too, same thing. I'm doing a lot of pulling and stuff like that. So I think pulling a crankbait, like you mentioned, that's a golden tip. And I do it subconsciously because I fish crankbaits so much now I don't even think about it. But now that I really think about it, I probably get more bites while I'm pulling my crankbait or when I'm stopping and burning it than any other time. So awesome tip there.
Here's the one thing I'll leave you guys with cranking retrieves like that is when you're talking about retrieve variations, so much of that's one aspect of fishing that comes from experience. It comes from muscle memory. Yeah. When you start to hit cover with a crankbait, there's an intuitive part of your fishing being based upon experience that sort of intuitively and instinctually tells you if you need to speed up or slow down. It's hard to explain, but the more you fish, the more years you get under your belt as an angler, you'll know what I'm talking about, that mind muscle memory, aspect of crankbait fishing.
Yeah, it's definitely an art form to get those crankbaits through brush or through cover without getting hung up. And it takes time doing it, but it's definitely worth it once you get that right art of knowing when it's about to hang up, pulling it free, burning it, speeding it up. And one other thing I will say that I actually noticed recently in one of the recent videos I made, I'd never noticed I did it until I was trying to make a segment about my retrieve. When I'm fishing a crankbait over like kind of more like gravelly rock bottom where I'm not bumping into anything or like really getting in some thick cover, especially on like just flatter gravel banks, I actually reel my crankbait and I'll twitch my rod almost like I'm flaring a jerkbait. And while I'm reeling it, I just give it one big twitch and reel it and twitch it a couple times. And I've actually seen KVD do this when he was doing a chest cam video. They just showed him fishing a crankbait for like 20 minutes, and he did this all the time, just fishing a straight bank. And I've done it for years watching now. I went back and watched like 5 or 6 other clips from like the last 4 years, and I do it so much where I'm just reeling my crankbait in, and without even thinking about it, I just give it a twitch when I don't hit something for 5 or 10 seconds. I just literally pull the rod tip and kind of make that bait deflect or move when it's not hitting cover. So if you're not hitting anything for a while, jerk your rod tip a couple times to flare that bait. I think I've just got bit doing it so many times over the years. I literally never even think about it. I only notice it because I watch myself on camera doing it, and you have no idea how many times when I watch my fish catches from the past, right when I do that, I get bit. So those are little things that are a pretty big deal. Cool. So that is the third biggest mistake that new anglers for crankbaits, or a lot of anglers who throw crankbaits, make. They don't vary their retrieve enough. They don't pay attention to their speed of retrieve. The next thing I want to talk about is equipment. That's something that some of the guys are already asking about in the side. We want to talk about color application as well, but let's kind of skip to number 5 and then go back to 4, which is equipment. And a lot of guys are wondering, what equipment do you use for your crankbaits? And I'll give you guys my suggestions first here, and then I'll have Randy give his suggestions as well. And I'm pretty straightforward with my crankbait equipment. In terms of the rods, I've been throwing the same rods with my deep diving crankbaits and shallow diving crankbaits since I was like 13 years old. And that is an Abu Garcia Veritas Winch casting rod. They've made older versions of this rod dating back till 2010, and I've been throwing these for about 11 years. I have some that are still probably 8 or 9 years old. And these Veritas Winch crankbait rods, they are a really solid rod. They have a moderate action. That's really the key you're going to find with a lot of good crankbait rods is they're going to have a moderate taper. That is really key for me personally. And what I do is I match up the weight of my crankbaits to the actual lure weight that's recommended on these rods. So if you take a look, you can see that this is the 7-foot medium action Abu Garcia winch. And this is good for 1/4 ounce to 5/8 ounce crankbaits. So I throw this exact rod when I'm throwing my flat side crankbaits, smaller square bill crankbaits, and basically this lure weight is really key because it helps judge if you're going to be able to cast the bait effectively. If you throw a bait that's too heavy for this rod, for example, you're not going to be able to get the right distance. Or, for example, if you go to the 7-foot medium heavy and you try throwing a 1/4 ounce crankbait, you're not going to be able to cast it very far because it's not balanced properly to handle lighter baits. So I would honestly recommend picking up all 4 of these rods if you really want to get serious into crankbait fishing. The nice thing is they're $99, so you can pick up, you don't really need this extra heavy one usually, but you can pick up these rods right here, these first 4 rods. It will cover all of your crankbait fishing applications, and you can get them all for around $400 total, which is a really good deal. And what I basically, some of these are out of stock as you can see, but you can pick them up at tackle shops too, and over at Academy Sports. They have them, Bass Pro Shops everywhere. And really my 2 favorites are the 7-foot medium and then the 7.6 medium heavy. These are really good crankbait rods that are going to hold up to a lot of different applications. I like the 7-foot medium when I'm fishing against square bills, smaller crankbaits like a rock crawler, wiggle wart, stuff like that. And then I throw the 7'6" medium heavy when I'm fishing deeper diving crankbaits, whether that's a Strike King 6XD, an 8XD, Strike King Series 5 crankbaits. And then the only time I go to the 711 medium heavy is when I'm throwing those really big crankbaits, or the 711 heavy action. That's when I'm throwing like a Strike King 10XD. This crankbait rod works really well. Actually, I like the extra heavy even better, actually, now I'm thinking about it. I have all of these rods, but the extra heavy works great for those big, super deep diving, like 10XD style crankbaits. But this is still a pretty good rod for your regular 6XDs and stuff as well, this 711 heavy. And I pair all of these with actually an Abu Garcia Winch Black Max reel. You can actually pick up that reel, Randy, on at Walmart. I buy them at Walmart. I don't know where else you can find them, but there's a Black Max Winch crankbait reel, and I think you can find some. Actually, let me try to find one right here through Abu Garcia, and I'll find that while you kind of talk about your rods that you recommend. I'll see if I can find that. So what do you recommend, Randy, for your equipment?
Yeah, basically, like for shallow cranking, we're talking about. I basically have 3 different rods I use for all my crankbait fishing, shallow and deep too. But the 3 that I use are based upon the type of crankbait I'm using. If I'm using some type of heavier crankbait, like say that Megabass 2.0 S crank, or like the Deep 6 Megabass, some of the bigger, heavier crankbaits, my favorite rod is that Megabass Orochi Extreme Mission Tight, and that's a 7'5" rod. It's got a medium, sort of not really stiff, but sort of just a typical medium tip on it, a good taper down to a stiff butt on there. The reason I like that rod, it's a long rod. You can make a long cast, and particularly on big crankbaits like that, I like a little bit stiffer rod because when you stop and go those big crankbaits, a stiffer rod, it gives that bait a little bit more lively looking action. If you use a real soft rod tip when you're pulling a big crankbait like that, unless you're pointing the rod tip straight at the bait, it's a little bit sluggish. Now, if I go to the medium type crankbaits like the Megabass, Deep X 300 or the Z2 crank, or maybe like the S crank 1.5, a little bit smaller one, that's when I go to the Megabass Orochi flat side special. It's a 7-foot rod. It's got a medium tip on it. It's a little bit shorter. And I like the little bit shorter rod because on those type of crankbaits, I'm usually making some type of a shorter cast around objects or something, around laydowns, brush, that type of stuff, where I'm not really needing the distance. So it gives me the casting accuracy, yet the efficiency to work the bait real good. On the small crankbaits that I'm fishing, any type of lighter crankbaits, that's when I use a spinning rod. And I use the same spinning rod that I do with my jerk baits, the Megabass Orochi Whip Snake. It's a 6'11" spinning rod. It's got a medium tip on it. And any of those small type crankbaits I'm fishing, flat side crankbaits, those crankbaits that are real light, like shad wraps, that type of stuff. I'm fishing on the spinning rod. And line size, like I said, it depends on the variation of the bait I'm using, but it's usually 6 to 25 pound test, Seaguar, and Invizix fluorocarbon. If I'm fishing square bills around super shallow water, sometimes I use monofilament because I don't want that stretch. And for the reels, I use the Lew's BB1 speed spool. If you guys have seen my videos, you probably call it the Screaming Mimi because they're so old that they really make a lot of noise. Actually, I've had them like 7 years, so I've got to get some new reels. But that Lew's BB1 speed spool, it's a 7.1 gear ratio. I use nothing but 7.1 gears on every reel because I want to know what my reel's doing all the time without having to mess with gear ratios. So I just adjust my speed or retrieve, with how fast I crank the handle. And on the spinning reel, I use the Lew's TLC 3000, which is a wide spooled spinning reel.
Awesome. Good stuff. That's a good run in there. And I found some of these reels, guys. This is the Abu Garcia Black Max, $50. This is what I like to throw. Randy, you probably think it's crazy I throw all Black Max reels, but I find that they just work great for me offshore. I can bomb them a mile, and they're $50.
You can cast a mile. I've seen you do it, man.
I can outcast pretty much anyone with these Black Maxes. They fire into the wind. It doesn't matter. So I throw a Black Max a lot, and they do make a Black Max winch. So the regular Black Max is a 6:4 gear ratio reel, and that's actually not too bad when I'm fishing square bill crankbaits and like flat side crankbaits in a little bit shallower water, even like a rock crawler crankbait. But whenever I'm going to the bigger deep diving crankbaits, like a striking 6XD, I like a 5:3 gear ratio reel or a 5:4. This is the Abu Garcia Revo winch, which is $199, but you can find at Walmart the Black Max Revo winch, or it's not the Revo, the Black Max winch reel. And the thing is it'll say winch on it, and it's a 5:4 gear ratio reel. You can basically buy 4 of those for the price of this one Revo winch, and for me, they work almost identically. They have a big wide spool, you can put a bunch of line on them and fire them a mile, so I find that you can just use the Black Max winch reel, basically you can buy 4 reels for the price of 1, pair them up with those $100 rods, all in, you're going to be spending like $600 and you get 4 crankbait setups, $150 a piece, and it's literally exactly what I throw. And there was a question about the spinning reels. I do the same thing with my spinning reels. I use the Abu Garcia Max Pro spinning reel. It's one I've been testing out, and I like it a lot. I like the 30 size. It seems like it's the right size. $50. Works great. Drag system works great. So I love cheap reels. I don't know why. I did a reel review, Randy, a while back, and I wanted to do some cheap reels just for fun. And I didn't really expect anything out of the reel. But then I threw it for like a year and I had no issues, and it became like one of my favorite reels to throw. So I don't know why, but it's what I like to throw. One thing too, real quick, guys, is if you are going to check out any of the equipment we're talking about in this live stream, we really appreciate it if you'd head over to fishthemoment.com and went to the Support Fish the Moment tab. Here you'll find a Tackle Warehouse affiliate link. And if you just click this Tackle Warehouse link, it'll take you straight to Tackle Warehouse, and you can find the URL at the top. And if you bookmark the URL right up here, it's up here somewhere. If you bookmark the URL, every time you check out on Tackle Warehouse, we'll get a small percentage of the profits from your purchase, and it helps support us without doing anything else. If you just like the content, go to the Support Fish the Moment page, use this Tackle Warehouse link. You can either just go here every time and click it and then check out. And as long as you don't leave Tackle Warehouse's website after clicking this link before checking out, we get a percentage of the profits. And again, a safe way to make sure you're going to do it is just bookmark this link on the top of your page. So every time you use Tackle Warehouse, you're helping us out a little bit. So that's it for the rod, reel, stuff like that. Do you have anything else, Randy, to kind of add on that end?
Yeah, a lot of it's just getting comfortable with the setup you have. And they're not one rod. The reels and line and all that type of stuff, there's a little bit of give in there, but there's not one rod that you can really use for all your crankbaits. You just need to use the ones that allow for you to be the most efficient with the bait. So a lot of options out there.
Yep. Yeah, for sure. Cool. And then the other thing on equipment that we wanted to touch on really quickly is hooks. hooks are a big deal with crankbait fishing, and I don't know about you, Randy, but every time I take a crankbait out of the package, regardless of the brand, I'm always upgrading the treble hooks, the stop treble hooks, 100% of the time. It's just a rule of thumb for me. I always do it because it always helps me land more fish. Would you agree on that?
Oh, there's no doubt. When a fish is eating a crankbait, you can have junky rusted hooks on it and still catch them. But the reason that you want to use the best and the right hook on your crankbait is to get those nippers, because most of the time they're not eating a crankbait real good. They're always nipping at it and getting the back hook. So that's why the type of hook and style is critical.
For sure, and I have a couple styles that I like, and I know you have some styles you like as well, Randy, so we'll kind of run through those. For offshore crankbait fishing, my go-to hook, and I've been throwing it forever, is the Gamakatsu EWG treble hook. Gamakatsu EWG, and I find that on most crankbaits that I throw that are in the, let's say the 1 to 2 inch size crankbaits, whether that's like a square bill crankbait, a medium diving crankbait like a rock crawler, using a size 4 treble hook works really, really well. The size 4 Gamakatsu EWG is a great just go-to treble for kind of your medium diving crankbaits, I would say. Maybe not as many. Some square bills, some medium diving crankbaits can't handle this big of a hook, but I throw this size hook as much as I can on those medium diving crankbaits. But when I go to a bigger crankbait like a Strike King 6XD, for example, my go-to size is the size 2. So go to the size 2 EWG treble. And I have caught so many fish on these hooks and hardly ever lose any fish on a crankbait when you pair the proper rod with these hooks. And the last thing I'd use is I use monofilament line when I'm cranking. So I'll actually use 10-pound monofilament. It has extra stretch, so when those fish pull, they pull the stretch out of the line and don't pull straight on the hook, and you won't lose as many fish. So if you pair up 10-pound monofilament line with a really nice Abu Garcia winch rod that bends in half pretty much, and then use these Gamakatsu treble hooks, you will hardly ever lose a fish on a deep diving crankbait. Now, sometimes these hooks are not going to quite be big enough to get the job done, so you can go to some of these short shank treble hooks and go to like a 1/0 hook. This is the Gamakatsu EWG short shank 2X. If you go to a 1/0 hook, those sometimes can be better for your like 8XD or 10XD crankbaits, those bigger deep diver crankbaits. And sometimes they even go to like an owner stinger hook that's a 2/0 hook, short shank. And those work really good on your giant big crankbaits, 10XDs. And then when you have your little crankbaits like a Spro rock crawler, a lot of times you need to use very specific hooks for that bait. And in the wintertime, I find that I also don't like to use an EWG style hook. So in the winter, I actually go to these Gamakatsu round bend trebles in bronze, and I use the size 5. So a size 5 round bend treble hook is awesome when I'm fishing like a rock crawler crankbait or a smaller, more compact crankbait in the winter, and also when I'm fishing flat side crankbaits in the winter. Basically, my rule of thumb is throw a round bend in the winter, and then in the summer, when those fish are more aggressive, I go to a EWG style hook. The only exception is when I'm deep cranking. I just always throw an EWG when I'm deep cranking. Never had any issues with fish missing my bait. Usually they eat it pretty well. So whenever I'm deep cranking, the EWG trebles, and then I'll go to EWGs in the summer when I'm shallow cranking, round beds in the winter when I'm cranking. And that's pretty much a hook selection. What are your thoughts there, Randy?
Oh man, hooks are a complicated topic because so much of it has to do with the space of your hook hangers on your crankbait and the length of the treble hook that you're using. Because the thing that you don't want about crankbaits is you don't want those hooks fouling all the time. So you definitely don't want to use a hook that has a shank too big that's fouling your hooks. And that's one of the things about, like Jonny was talking about, the EWGs. They have shorter shanks on them for the most part, so they're a really good choice on a crankbait. But for me, what I use is I've pretty much went the last few years to that Gamakatsu G Finesse treble. It's a nano coated treble. It's got an O'Shaughnessy bend on it, and it's got a fairly small barb. So you have a really easy penetration with the nano coat and the small barb. And I'm looking for penetration a lot of times more than even holding power, because what you have on some of the hook brands like Mustads, for example, they're a good hook, but they got a really big barb on them, and they're great once the hook gets penetrated. But a lot of times on crankbait fishing, you have problems with penetration, and that's when you lose those fish. Once you get a fish hooked and penetrated past the barb on any barb, a lot of times it's hard for that bass to throw that, bait unless they make multiple real hard jumps. So for mine, most of them, I go to the G-Finesse Gamakatsu treble. The only other times is if I'm fishing, say, for example, some baits that have the real close hook hangers, like some of the lipless crankbaits are really, really bad about that, where the hook hangers are close together. That's when I will go to the shorter shanked EWG Gamakatsu on those particular ones, simply to keep my hooks from fouling up. Because although I like the O'Shaughnessy bend as far as on a treble, for me, it's more important not to have those hooks fouling, because I've lost a lot of fish over the years when those fish hit it and the bait's got the hooks fouled in it. And a lot of times you don't even know why that happens. I mean, think about it, guys. Think about how many times you've been crankbait fishing and you're reeling and you got a fish on and you reel it halfway to the boat and it just comes off under the water. I promise you, a lot of the times when that happens, it's because your hooks are crossed or fouled, and those fish just aren't hooked, and they just open the mouth and they get off like that. So, again, it's experimentation. The hook style is dependent upon the bait. It's dependent upon the body profile, the hook hanger lengths. There's a lot of variables with it.
Good stuff. Awesome. Well, that is it for our equipment. There's probably other stuff we missed. If you guys do want to learn more about equipment and just bass fishing tackle, check out Randy's YouTube channel. It's Intuitive Angling with Randy Blockett, and he talks about equipment. He's actually doing a series right now on all the different types of categories of baits. He just got done talking about flat side crankbaits, talked about balsa versus plastic crankbaits, different lipless crankbaits, all kinds of crankbait stuff going on. And he talks about all kinds of tackle every single day. So check out those YouTube videos from Randy if you haven't seen them. And the last thing we want to talk about, we're kind of running short on time here, so we're going to kind of speed through this a little bit. But the last mistake we see anglers make when they're crankbait fishing is not choosing the right color crankbait for the situation. Color selection can be really crucial. We could talk about color selection for 2 hours if we wanted to, but I'm going to give you kind of the basic rundown for the offshore crankbaits, and then Randy can kind of take you through a quick rundown of the shallow running crankbaits. So for me, I'm not as big of a color snob as other guys are. I'm actually colorblind, so it's not as big of a deal for me. But whenever I'm offshore cranking, I do find that there's 2 or 3 colors that outperform any other color day in and day out. The first color that is the staple in offshore crankbait fishing is a chartreuse powder blueback crankbait. This is by far the best deep crankbait color, whether you're in clear water or in dirty water. For whatever reason, they just love this color. And it's the number one color I go to. I start with a chartreuse powder blueback in almost every single situation, any water clarity, any conditions. Now, the only exception to that is I might also mix it up with a chartreuse powder, or a chartreuse with a greenback. And I just kind of do that if I feel like the fish are getting conditioned to that powder blueback. If I'm catching a lot of fish on the blueback, I'll go to the greenback. But I carry basically chartreuse greenback and chartreuse blueback. And then the second color I throw a lot is some sort of more muted shad color. And this is my favorite color in the striking lineup, the sexy blueback herring color. A lot of guys like sexy shad, but for some reason, I don't actually catch as many fish on sexy shad as I used to when it first came out. I find that more muted kind of natural colors, but with that bright yellow line across it, like the sexy blueback herring, really get the job done. And I'll throw this color when I feel like the fish are still pretty aggressive, but the conditions are a little bit brighter and clearer. So if you have bright bluebird skies and less wind, the sexy blueback herring works better, versus when you have cloud cover and a lot of wind, the chartreuse with the blueback works better. And then if the fish are biting a crankbait, but it's really bright skies, really calm, I really like a green gizzard shad. It's a very muted color, and it works great. The only other color that I'll throw a lot with my deep diving crankbaits is some sort of crawfish pattern. And for some reason, I find that a bright red crankbait offshore can just crush them, even when bass are feeding on shad. And I know for sure, for a fact, they're feeding on shad because I see them down their throat. But sometimes picking up a red crankbait and throwing it out on those schools of fish can get those fish fired up. And not that many guys will throw a red crankbait in the middle of the summer. Now in the winter, a lot of guys will throw deep diving crankbaits in red, but if you're fishing, let's say, a ledge where fish are feeding on gizzard shad in the middle of the summer, sometimes you can go from a chartreuse colored crankbait or a shad colored crankbait and throw this delta red or a red colored crankbait and start catching them like crazy as if they've never seen the crankbait before. So my go-to colors are basically the ones I just showed you there. 3 basic styles: a chartreuse color, a shad color, and a red color. That's basically what I go with my offshore crankbaits. And I do go to the reds a lot more in the winter because those fish start feeding more heavily on crawfish. So that's kind of another call out there. But that's what I go with. Randy, what would you say on the crankbait color?
Yeah, just a real quick little mini seminar here on colors, because like I said, Jonny, we could have a whole 3-hour deal on just colors. But think of your crankbait colors in terms of the forage. Basically, anything with chartreuse is resembling a perch. Anything that's a shad pattern is a shad. Anything that's a red or orange is a crawfish pattern. And simplify it in that sense. Basically, I agree with what Jonny said on the chartreuse pattern. If the chartreuse crankbaits will catch the biggest aggressive fish if there is in the area right off the bat. It's a good bait to throw right off the bat in the morning. It's a good bait to throw on cloudy, windy days, or if the fish are aggressive. If the fish are not quite as aggressive, the water's a little bit clearer, I like to throw some type of a shad pattern, whether it be a translucent type shad or a flat finish, doesn't really matter. Those are for a little bit less aggressive fish. When the water temperature is below 55 degrees, particularly in the pre-spawn, you can't beat any type of orange or red. That's going to be a big color consideration there. But I like to totally match my colors based upon the water clarity. Water clarity, also sky conditions, how much sunlight penetrations in there in the water. But you need those 3 combinations. You need some type of chartreuse, some type of shad, some type of crawfish pattern, and just mix it up based upon water temperature and clarity.
For sure. Really, you can't go wrong with those 3 colors. I know you throw a bluegill pattern as well, which is a bigger player up shallow than it is offshore because there's not really as many bluegill out really deep.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, guys, that is all we have time for tonight, but hopefully you enjoyed this live stream. I had a blast talking through all these different things, and one more thing to call out, if you guys are still here and you're watching this live stream, go down below and subscribe to the Fish the Moment Live YouTube channel so you don't miss upcoming streams. This is not the Fish the Moment channel. This is a new channel. Go subscribe. It would really help if we could get to 1,000 subscribers, because actually we can start monetizing these streams and actually make a living doing what we're doing. So it would really help if we get to 1,000 subscribers on this channel. So even if you have to share it out with your brother, your family, whatever, if you're like Fish the Moment, share out the channel, get some subscribers here. It really help us out. And also leave a like on this live stream. It'll definitely help out to get this video out to more people. And we're also going to be making supercuts and basically uploading a video pretty much every single day on this channel of short segments from the live stream. We're going to be starting that later this week, so you should be able to stay tuned to the Fish the Moment Live YouTube channel to see a ton of just shortcut videos that will have a lot of great tips. You don't have to dive through the entire video again to watch the tips. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the stream. Randy, how'd you think it went?
Really good, man. We blew through these topics. We could have probably picked one of those 5 and talked the entire time on it. So we just really went through it quick, everybody, real just foundational overview. And I'm sure we'll be talking in much more detail about all this in the future.
For sure. And again, check out Randy's YouTube channel, Intuitive Angling with Randy Blockett. He has a lot of great videos on his channel talking about baits and all the specifics. Every single day he's posting. And I have a video coming up this Thursday on the Fish the Moment channel all about live scope. So we kind of got the old school and new school going. My live scope video, Randy's going to be awesome. I have a bunch of 4 to 6 pounders on camera on live scope. So excited to share that with everyone. And hopefully you guys will enjoy that content. I know not everyone loves live scope, but it's the future of the game, and I'm enjoying learning about it. So not every video is going to be about live scope, but at least a couple, why not?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, guys, thanks again for checking out the stream, and we'll see you guys next week. We'll be here every single Tuesday, 7 p.m. Central Time on the Fish Moment Live YouTube channel, and you can also check us out on the Apple Podcast app and Spotify app at the Fish the Moment Podcast. Thanks again for checking out the stream. We'll see y'all next time.